My name is Kate Kirkpatrick. I am the Tutorial Fellow in Philosophy at Regent's Park College, Oxford. Welcome to my exp. Existentialism is sometimes defined as a literary period rather than a philosophical one, and it includes works like Michel Leiry's his book Manhood. And Beauvoir read that book and thought that she'd like to write a similar book about what it means to become a woman. So the conversation with Sartre was certainly part of the story of the genesis of the second sex, but Beauvoir's wider reading was also extremely important. And I like to think of the second sex as a work which was polygenetic, a work that had many different sources of inspiration, including Beauvoir's reading, her conversations with her contemporaries, her experiences as a woman, the experiences of her friends. And so I think if we look at it this way, it emerges as a much more complicated work. It's often been described as a book that applies Sartre's philosophy. But in fact, Beauvoir had already developed distinctive positions of her own in the 1940s with respect to existentialist ethics. And she also had a conception of what it means to be a self, which was different from Sartre's. So I won't say too much more about that now, but what I think is important when considering the origins of the second sex is that Beauvoir had already experienced many of the inequalities that affected women. And I'm not just talking about material inequalities, although those were certainly quite stark, but also the inequalities in the ways that women felt within themselves about their own freedom. The Second Sex was published in 2 volumes, and it's the structure of the book, I think, is very important, because in the first volume, which was called Facts and Myths, she talks about women as they have been described by some men. She discusses history, she discusses biology, she discusses materialism, psychoanalysis, and she's interested in this question of definition. So what is a woman? But it's not just the concept of woman that she's interested in. She's also interested in the concept of femininity. What does it mean to be feminine? Because she knew already in 1949 that some women were not considered women just by virtue of being biologically female. They were considered bad women because they were insufficiently feminine. And so in the first volume, she looks at biology and history and psychoanalysis, and she also looks at literature because she was fascinated by the ways that women were depicted in literary works, because they were frequently defined not on their own terms as people who could have projects for their own lives, but rather as ancillary subjects whose purpose was to love men. In volume 2, she says, now let's look at what women say about what it's like to grow up under this hegemony of myths which have been largely defined by men, and myths which largely serve to maintain a hierarchy that benefits men. And in that second volume, we get at the beginning this claim that one is not born, but rather becomes a woman. One of the things that's frequently overlooked, I think, in discussions of this sentence is that in the first volume, she's already used that formulation. And she says in volume 1, one is not born, but rather becomes a genius, because she's interested in why it is that women have contributed relatively little to the great works of art and investigation. And she says that we should look at how they came to be in this position of creating so little, given that, as Beauvoir saw it, they were capable of much more. And so over the second volume, she talks about childhood, she talks about sexual initiation, she talks about motherhood, and she talks about love, lesbianism. This second volume really shocked her contemporaries. It caused a scandal. And what she was doing there was saying that this mythology of womanhood and the expectations of femininity are oppressive, and we don't have to perpetuate them. The influence of the second sex on feminism is a question that is, it's really fascinating, in part because it's so context dependent. The second sex has been interpreted as a work of skepticism about sexual difference, which claims that what we now call gender is socially constructed. And that reading is very common in the United States and to some extent also in the UK. But in China, for example, the second sex was read as a feminist work that supported a sexual difference view of feminism, where there are differences between men and women by virtue of their biology. So one of the things that's fascinating about this book is that it's generated such divergent readings, and that whatever the reading is, it's galvanized women in different political contexts to pursue their freedom as they conceive of it.